Chapter 16 The Girl in the Cage. Kazrak and I returned to his tent, and until the early morning we discussed the possibilities of rescuing Talina. We turned over a number of plans, none of which seemed likely to succeed. It would be presumably suicidal to make any direct attempt to cut through to her, and yet, if this was the last resort, I knew I would make the attempt. In the meantime, until the city fell or Parkour altered his plans, she would presumably be safe. It seemed unlikely that Parkour would be so politically naive as to use the girl before she had publicly accepted him as her free companion, according to the rights of Ar. Treated as a pleasure slave, she would have negligible political value. On the other hand, the thought of her in the tents of Parkour did enrage me, and I knew I would be unable to restrain myself indefinitely. For the time being, however, Kazrak's counsel of patience won me over, convincing me that any precipitous action would almost surely doom to failure. Accordingly, for the next few days I remained with Kazrak and bided my time. I dyed my hair black and acquired the helmet and gear of an assassin. Across the temple of the Black Helmet I fixed the golden sash of the messenger. In this disguise I freely wandered about the camp, observing the siege operations, the appointment of the compounds, the marshalling of troops. Occasionally I would climb halfway up one of the siege towers under construction, and observe the city of Ar and the skirmishes that took place between it and the first ditch. Periodically the shrill notes of alarm bugles would pierce the air as forces from Ar emerged to do battle upon the plains before the city. When this occurred, inevitably the spearmen and lancers of Parkour followed the lead of siege slaves through the maze of stakes and traps, and would engage the men from Ar. Sometimes the forces of Parkour drove the warriors of Ar back to the very walls of the city, forcing them back through their gates. Sometimes the forces of Ar would drive the men of Parkour back against their defensive stakes, and once they drove them to take refuge across the now constructed siege bridges spanning the great ditch. Still, there was little doubt that Parkour's men had the best of things. The human resources on which Parkour could draw seemed inexhaustible, and as important, he had at his command a considerable force of Thalian cavalry, an arm almost lacking to the men of Ar. In these battles the skies would be filled with Tarnsmen, from Ar and from the camp, firing into the massed warriors below, engaging one another in savage duels hundreds of feet within the air. But gradually the Tarnsmen of Ar became diminished, overwhelmed by the superior forces which Parkour could, and ruthlessly liberty, throw against them. On the 9th day of the siege, the sky belonged to Parkour, and the forces of Ar no longer emerged from their great gate. All hope of lifting the siege by battle was now gone. The men of Ar remained within their walls, under their tarn wire, waiting for the attacks to come, while the initiates of the city sacrificed to the priest-kings. On the 10th day of the siege, small engines, such as covered catapults and ballistae, were flown across the ditches by Tarn teams, and soon were engaged in artillery duels with the engines mounted upon the walls of Ar. Simultaneously, exposed chains of siege slaves began to move the stake lines forward. After some 4 days of bombardment, which probably had small effect if any, the first true assault was mounted. It began several hours before dawn, as the giant siege towers, covered now with plates of steel to counter the effect of the fire arrows and burning tar, were slowly rolled across the bridge ditches. By noon they were within crossbow range of the walls, and after dark and the light of the torches, the first tower did reach the walls. Within the hour 3 others had also touched the first wall. Around these towers and on top of them warriors swarmed. Above them Tarnsman marked Tarnsman in battles to the death. Rope ladders from Ar brought defenders 200 feet down to the wall, to the level of those towers. Through small postern gates other defenders rushed against the towers upon the ground, only to be met by Parkor's clustered support troops. From the height of the walls, some 200 feet above the towers, missiles would be fired, and stones dropped. Within the towers, sweating naked siege slaves, under the frenzied whips of their overseers, hauled upon those great chains that swung the mighty steel rams into the wall and back again. One of Parkor's towers was undermined. It tilted crazily, and then crashed into the dust amidst the screaming of its doomed occupants. Another was captured and lit afire. But 5 more towers rolled slowly toward the walls of Ar, and these towers were fortresses in themselves that would be unobtained at all costs. Hour in and hour out they continued their work, gnawing like rats upon the walls. Meanwhile, at several points in the city and at randomly selected times, picked clansmen of Parkor, each of these Tarns carrying a dangling knotted rope of 9 spearmen, dropped to the wires at the tops of cylinders, landing their small task forces of raiders. These task forces seldom ever managed to return, but sometimes they were outstandingly successful. On the 20th day of the siege there was a great rejoicing in the camp of Parkor, because in one place the wires had been cut, and a squad of spearmen had reached the main siege reservoir, emptying their barrels of toxic kanda, a lethal poison extracted from one of Gor's desert shrubs. The city would now have to depend primarily upon private wells, and the hope of rain. It seemed probable that food and water would soon be scarce in the cities, and that the initiates, whose resistance had been unimaginative, and who were apparently unable to protect the city, would be forced to face a hungry and desperate population. The fate of Marlenus during these days was in doubt. I was certain that he had entered the city in some manner, presumably waiting for his chance to strike upon the homestones of the tributary cities, in order, if possible, to divide the horde of Parkor. Then, in the 4th week of the siege, my heart did fall. Marlenus and several men had indeed entered the city, it seemed, but they had been discovered, and had been sealed off from the very cylinder of the homestones. Indeed, in that cylinder they had been his palace upon the days of his glory. Marlenus and his men had command of the top floor and a roof of the cylinder, but there was little hope he could use the homestones that now lay within his grasp, for he and his men had no Tarns, and the retreat had been cut off. Moreover, the ubiquitous Tarn wire heavily netted upon the area of the central cylinder would ward off any attempts at rescuing, unless perhaps by a large force. Parkor, of course, was pleased to leave Marlenus precisely where he was, to be destroyed by the men of Ar. Oh, lo, Parkor was not so much a fool as to bring the tributary homestones to his camp, and risk disuniting his horde before the siege was even completed. Indeed, it was probable that Parkor had no intention of returning the homestones at all, but was determined to follow upon those imperial footsteps of Marlenus himself. I wondered how long Marlenus could hold out. It would surely depend in part upon the food and water available, and on the persistence of the initiate's attempts to dislodge him. I was confident that there could be cisterns and canisters of water upon the palace, and I suppose that Marlenus, as an enlightened precaution, in view of the unstable politics of Ar, would have outfitted his cylinder as a keep, laying in stores of food, missile weapons. At any rate, my plan for the division of the homestones had failed, and Millennius, on whom I had depended, was, in the language of the game, neutralized, if not wholly removed from the board. In despair, Kazrak and I discussed these matters over and over. The probability of ours resisting the siege was most minimal. One thing at least remained to be done. There must be an attempt to rescue Talina. Another plan entered my head, but I dismissed it as too far-fetched, unworthy of consideration. Kazrak noticed my frown and demanded to know from what heart I had. The siege might be lifted, I said, if a force could take Parkour by surprise, a force of some thousands of warriors attacking from the unprotected side of the camp. Kazrak smiled. "That is true. Where will you find this army?" I hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Korba, perhaps Thentis." Kazrak looked upon me in disbelief. "Are you rid of your senses?" he asked. "The fall of Ar will be Kalnawine to the free cities of Gor. When Ar falls, there will be rejoicing in the streets. When Ar falls, the bridges will be hung with garlands. There will be free Paga, slaves will be freed, and enemies will pledge friendship." "How long will it last?" I inquired, "with Parkour upon the throne of Ar?" Kazrak seemed suddenly to darken with thought. "Parkour will not destroy the city," I said. "He will keep as much of his hoard as he can." "Yes," said Kazrak, "there will be little cause for rejoicing." Marlinus had a dream of empire, but the ambition of Parkour will yield only a nightmare of oppression and tyranny. "It is unlikely that Marlinus will ever again be a danger," said Kazrak. "Even should he survive, he is outlawed now within his own city." "But Parkour," I said, "as Ubar of Ar, will once again threaten all Gor." "True," said Kazrak, looking at me most questioningly. "Why should not the free cities of Gor unite to defeat Parkour?" "The cities never unite," responded Kazrak. "Oh no, they never have," I said. "But surely, if Parkour is to be stopped, this is the time, not after he is master of Ar." "The cities never unite," repeated Kazrak, shaking his head. "Take this ring," I said, giving him the ring that bore the crest of Cabot. "Show it to the administrator of Korba, and to the administrator of Thentis, and to all the Ubars or administrators of whatever cities you can. Tell them to raise the siege. Tell them they must strike now, and that you come with this Mechil from Tal Cabot, warrior of Korba." "I would be impaled," said Kazrak, rising to his feet, "but I will go." With a heavy heart, I watched Kazrak loop his sword belt over his shoulder and pick up his helmet. "Goodbye, sword brother," he said. He turned and left the tent, as if he might have been merely going to the Thalian corrals, or to take his post for guard duty, as in our caravan days. I felt a choking sensation in my throat, and I asked myself if I had just sent my friend to his death. In a few minutes I gathered together my own gear, and put upon the heavy black helmet of the assassin. I left the tent, and turned my steps in the direction of the tents of Parkour. I made my way to the interior perimeter of the second ditch, opposite the great gate of Ar in the distance. There, on a hillock overlooking the palisades that rimmed the rampart of the ditch, I saw the wall of black silk that surrounded the compound of Parkour. Inside were the dozens of tents that formed the quarters of his personal retinue and his bodyguard. Above them, at several places, flew the black banner of the caste of assassins. I had neared the compound 100 times before, but this time I was determined to enter. I began to walk with a quickened pace. My heart began to beat most powerfully, and I felt the elation of a decision. I would act. It would be suicide to attempt to cut my way in, but Parkour was in the environs of R, directing the siege operations, and I might with some luck pass myself off as his messenger. Who would be bold enough to deny entrance to one whose helmet bore the golden sash of the courier? Without hesitation I climbed the hillock, and presented myself impatiently to the guards. "A message from Parkour," I said, "for the ears of Talina, his Ubar to be." "I will carry that message," said one of the guards, a large man, with his eyes suspicious. He regarded me most closely. Obviously, I was not someone who he knew. "The message is for the Ubara to be, and for her alone," I spoke angrily. "Do you deny admittance to the messenger Parkour?" "I do not know you," he growled. "Give me your name," I demanded, "so that I may report to Parkour who it is that denies his message to his future Ubara." There was a long, agonized silence. Then the guard stepped aside. I entered the compound, not having any settled plan, but feeling that I must contact Talina. Perhaps together we could arrange an escape at some later time. For the moment I did not even know where in the compound she might be kept. Within the first wall of black silk there was a second wall, this time of iron bars. Parkour was not as careless about his own safety as I had conjectured. Additionally, overhead I could see lines of torn wire. I walked about the second wall until I came to a gate, where I did repeat my story. Here I was admitted without any question, as though my helmet was sufficient guarantee in itself of my right to be there. Inside the second wall, I was escorted among the tents by a tower slave, some black girl whose livery was golden, and wore large golden earrings that matched her golden collar. Behind me, 2 guards fell into line. We stopped before a resplendent tent of yellow and red silk, some 40 feet in diameter, and 20 feet high upon the dome. I turned to my escort and the guards. "Wait here," I said. "My message is for the ears of she who is pledged to Parkour, and for her ears alone." My heart was beating loudly, and I wondered that they didn't hear it. I was amazed that my voice sounded so calm. The guards looked at one another, not having anticipated this request. The tower slave regarded me gravely, as though I had chosen to exercise some long-neglected or obsolescent privilege. "Wait here," I commanded, and I stepped inside the tent. And in that tent was a cage. It was perhaps a 10-foot cube, entirely enclosed. The heavy metal bars were coated with silver and set with precious stones. I noted with dismay that this cage had no door. It had literally been constructed about its prisoner. A girl sat within the cage, proudly upon a throne. She wore the concealing robes and veils, the full regalia of a Ubara. Something seemed to tell me to be careful. I don't know what it was. Something seemed to be wrong. I suppressed an impulse to call her name. I restrained an impulse to leap to the bars, to seize her, to crush her to them and to my lips. This must be Talina whom I loved, to whom my very life belonged. Yet I approached slowly, almost cautiously. Perhaps it was something in the carriage of that muffled figure, something in the way the head was held. It was much like Talina, but not as she had been. Had she been injured? Had she been drugged? Did she not recognize me? I stood before the cage. I lifted my helmet from my head. She gave no sign of recognition. I sought for some glimmer of awareness in those green eyes, for the slightest sign of affection or welcome. My voice sounded so far away. I am the messenger of Parkour, I said. He wishes me to say that the city will soon fall, and that you soon shall sit beside him upon the throne of Ar. Parkour is kind, said the girl. I was stunned. I revealed not the slightest of surprise, but indeed I was momentarily overwhelmed with the cunning of Parkour, and I rejoiced that I had followed something of Kazrak's counsel, of patience, of caution, that I had not disclosed my identity, that I had not attempted to cut my way to her side, to bring her out by the blade of the sword, for that would have been a mistake. The voice of the girl in the cage was not the voice of the girl I loved. The girl in the cage was not Talina.